It was a bright, buzzing afternoon in Atlanta, and we meet Senior Agent Layla Carter, a black woman with years of resilience and dedication under her belt. Layla, a trailblazer, had tirelessly devoted herself to a dangerous investigation, chasing down a formidable drug cartel that had eluded law enforcement for years. But today, her mind was focused on only one thing. She was close, so close to a breakthrough that her instincts told her would shatter the case wide open. She'd worked hard, sacrificed time with family, and endured grueling nights in a predominantly white, male-dominated field. Yet, Layla knew she'd earned her place in the FBI, though few acknowledged it. As she navigated the bustling city streets, her mind raced with details, organizing clues and evidence, pulling apart each layer she had uncovered. It was a puzzle, each piece meticulously studied and placed. But her thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected flash of blue and red lights appearing in her rearview mirror, forcing her to glance down at her speedometer in confusion. She wasn't speeding, and her mind ran through a list of possibilities: broken taillight, a missed stop sign, something minor. But none of it made sense. Shaking her head, she decided to pull over. Layla watched as the police car came to a stop behind her. Out stepped a tall, imposing officer, his hand resting a little too purposefully on his holstered weapon as he approached her window. She rolled it down, feeling her pulse quicken, but keeping her tone calm and neutral. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Her voice was respectful, her words professional, hoping to diffuse whatever misunderstanding this was. She reached for her FBI badge, ready to explain who she was and why she was on official duty. But Officer Riley barely glanced at her badge, his expression cold and unyielding. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone sharp and impersonal, as though he hadn't just seen the badge in her hand. Layla hesitated, taken aback. She'd dealt with difficult officers before, but this one, there was something different, something dark in his demeanor. "Officer, I'm a federal agent," she clarified, keeping her tone measured. "I'm on an assignment and headed back to my office." But Riley's face only hardened as he met her eyes with something close to disdain. He leaned closer, ignoring her words entirely. "I said step out of the vehicle," he barked, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of bystanders nearby. Layla felt her stomach drop, her hand instinctively tightening around her badge. Something about his tone, his stance, his cold disregard for her position set off alarm bells. She had been trained to handle high-stress situations, but this felt different. It was personal. "Officer, I am complying," she said, her voice firm but cautious, as she slowly opened the car door. Stepping out, she kept her hands visible, glancing at the curious onlookers gathering nearby, some already pulling out their phones to record. She had to stay calm, keep control of the situation, though the tension hung heavy in the air, and she could feel the racial undertones simmering beneath Riley's rigid facade. Before she could say another word, Riley seized her arm roughly, spinning her around and pressing her against the car with enough force that she winced. "What are you doing?" she protested, the disbelief clear in her voice. But Riley ignored her, sneering as he twisted her arm behind her back, locking her wrists in handcuffs. "Resisting arrest, are we?" he mocked, tightening the cuffs to the point of pain. Layla tried to reason with him, tried to keep her composure, but his cold, dismissive tone only sharpened. Her thoughts raced. She was a federal agent, someone who had dedicated her life to upholding the law, and yet here she was, being treated like a common criminal. Anger flared in her chest as she turned her head, meeting Riley's eyes with a defiant glare. "Officer Riley, you're making a mistake," she stated, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. But he only scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're untouchable?" he hissed. "Well, let me tell you something. Nobody's above the law. Not even you FBI types." Layla's mind raced, her heart pounding with the helplessness of the situation. She thought of her colleagues, wondering how they'd react when they found out she'd been wrongfully detained while on duty. Would they even believe her? As Riley pushed her into the back seat of his patrol car, Layla caught a glimpse of the crowd that had gathered, their expressions a mix of shock, dismay, and disbelief. Some were recording, but no one stepped forward to intervene. She closed her eyes, swallowing the humiliation, the sense of injustice burning within her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The patrol car pulled away, taking her farther from the city and into the outskirts, toward a police station she didn't recognize. Layla's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Riley was abusing his power, there was no doubt about it. But the question that lingered in her mind was, why? Was it because she was a black woman in a position of authority? Or was there something else, something deeper, that she wasn't seeing yet? Inside the police station, Layla's wrists throbbed from the tight handcuffs, her frustration and anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. Riley led her to a dimly lit interrogation room, shoving her roughly into a chair before pacing back and forth in front of her. "Let's get one thing straight," he snarled, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer. "I don't care who you say you are. As far as I'm concerned, you're just another criminal trying to pull a fast one." Layla met his gaze, refusing to show any fear. "You're violating my rights. You have no reason to hold me, and when this is over, you'll regret it." Riley's sneer deepened, but before he could respond, the door opened and a young officer stepped in. This was Officer Lucas, a rookie cop barely in his 30s, with an uneasy expression on his face. Layla's keen eyes picked up on the nervous glance he shot toward Riley, a flicker of discomfort that suggested he didn't fully agree with his superior's actions. He hesitated, shifting uncomfortably as he looked from Layla to Riley. "What are you waiting for?" Riley snapped, his eyes flashing with irritation. "Get her processed." Lucas stammered, nodding quickly and muttering an apology as he approached Layla with a file in hand. But when he looked into her eyes, there was something else. A flicker of empathy, perhaps even guilt. "I'm sorry about all this," he murmured, barely loud enough for her to hear. Layla's heart skipped a beat. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone in this station who saw what was happening and didn't agree with it. She held his gaze, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to do this. You know this isn't right." Lucas glanced back at Riley, visibly torn, before returning his gaze to Layla. He sighed, his hand trembling slightly as he began to process her information. The tension in the room was thick. Every glance, every slight movement, a silent battle between duty and conscience. Finally, as he finished, he looked at her with a pained expression, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll see what I can do." But before Layla could respond, Riley stormed back in, his gaze shifting suspiciously between Lucas and her. Layla quickly composed herself, watching as Riley barked orders, his voice laced with contempt. It was clear he enjoyed the power he held over her, relishing in every moment of her discomfort. As Riley continued to bark orders, the tension in the small interrogation room thickened. Layla could sense Lucas's discomfort growing as his senior officer's voice grew sharper, angrier. Riley's disdain for her was painfully obvious, each glare full of a suppressed anger she couldn't quite understand. What was it about her that provoked him so deeply? Layla wasn't just another detainee, she was a federal agent, and Riley's refusal to acknowledge that made her all the more determined. Finally, Riley paused, sneering at Lucas before locking eyes with Layla. "Get her into holding already," he ordered, his eyes full of contempt as he leaned in close, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We don't have all day, Agent Carter. After all, I've got better things to do than babysit a special agent." But Layla held her ground, meeting his gaze steadily. She could see something beyond his hatred, a kind of fear, carefully hidden but present in the corners of his steely eyes. She seized on this, her voice calm and unyielding. "Officer Riley, you may be holding me now, but you've already crossed a line. People are watching. This won't end well for you." A flicker of uncertainty flashed in Riley's eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by his usual smug expression. He waved dismissively at Lucas, clearly unimpressed. Lucas stepped forward, his expression apologetic as he motioned for her to follow. She rose slowly, looking back at Riley with a calm that masked her simmering anger. As Lucas led her down a narrow hallway toward a dimly lit holding cell, she couldn't shake the feeling that he might be the one person in this place she could rely on. She decided to take a chance, keeping her voice low so only he could hear. "You know this isn't right, Officer Lucas," she said, her tone even but imploring. "You don't have to be a part of this." He hesitated, glancing nervously at the security cameras in the hall. Finally, he whispered back, I know, but Riley, he's got a lot of influence. The whole department knows it. He's been around here longer than anyone." His voice trailed off, and Layla could sense the fear laced in his words. Layla gave him a small, reassuring nod. Just think about it. You have the power to do the right thing. Lucas's expression softened as he met her gaze, a flicker of determination shining through his hesitation. Once she was in the holding cell, Layla sat on the cold metal bench, gathering her thoughts. Riley's aggression, Lucas's conflicted glances, the eerie silence in the precinct. All of it hinted at something bigger than just a rogue cop with an attitude problem. Something was deeply wrong here. She couldn't afford to waste time. She needed to get out, call for backup, and expose whatever was happening in this precinct. But how? Hours passed, and the quiet darkness of the cell began to close in on her, the oppressive silence amplifying her thoughts. Layla forced herself to stay calm, breathing slowly and focusing on what her next steps would be once she got out of this cell. But then, suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up, surprised, as Lucas appeared at the door. His face was pale, his gaze darting nervously over his shoulder as he quickly unlocked the door. "Agent Carter," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "I'm getting you out of here, but we have to move fast." Layla's heart raced as she stood, her mind spinning with questions. Why was Lucas helping her? Was this a trap? But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the fear, the desperation, and something told her that this was real. Without another word, she followed him out of the cell. Lucas led her through a series of narrow, dimly lit corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They moved quickly, avoiding the main areas of the station where other officers might see them. Layla's senses were on high alert, every shadow and distant sound putting her on edge. She'd been trained for high-stakes situations like this, but escaping from inside a police station? This was different. As they neared an exit at the back of the station, Lucas paused, glancing around nervously before unlocking the door. "This is your chance," he whispered, urgency etched into his voice. "Get out before Riley finds out you're gone." Layla's mind raced. She wanted to believe she could trust Lucas, but the nagging question of why he'd helped her still lingered. She looked him in the eyes, searching for answers. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Lucas shifted uncomfortably, glancing down before meeting her gaze again. "Because it's wrong," he muttered. "What Riley's doing, it's not just wrong, it's illegal. I can't keep going along with it." There was a flicker of guilt in his eyes, a hint of remorse that told her he was sincere. Layla nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She didn't have time to question him further. The clock was ticking, and she knew Riley would be on their trail soon. She stepped through the door into the cold night air, feeling a brief wave of relief wash over her. But she wasn't out of danger yet. Keeping to the shadows, she made her way down the alley behind the station, her senses on high alert as she listened for any signs of pursuit. Her mind was racing. She needed to find a way to contact her team, let them know where she was and what had happened. But her phone had been confiscated back at the station, leaving her with no way to reach them. She pressed on, her steps quiet as she moved further away from the station. She would find a way out of this. She had to. As Layla slipped into the night, each step felt heavier with the weight of the unknown. She moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows, her mind focused on finding a way to communicate with her team at the FBI. The cold air stung her face, but she barely noticed. Every sense was heightened, her focus sharp, as she put as much distance as possible between herself and the station. But the eerie silence around her was shattered by the unmistakable sound of an engine revving nearby. Her heart skipped a beat. It was too close, too deliberate to be a coincidence. She darted down a narrow alley, ducking behind a dumpster, peering cautiously toward the street. Her pulse quickened as she spotted a patrol car slowly making its way down the road. She couldn't see the driver, but a terrible feeling twisted in her gut. A sense of dread washed over her as she recognized Riley's voice barking orders over the police radio. "All units, be advised, our agent has slipped out. She's not to get far, you understand?" His voice dripped with cold, calculated malice. Layla held her breath, waiting until the car passed before she darted out of her hiding place. She needed to keep moving, but the realization was sinking in. This man was relentless, and it wasn't just about the arrest. Riley wanted her to disappear. Layla hurried down the street, glancing around for any sign of a gas station or payphone, somewhere she could call for help. But her heart sank as she realized the neighborhood was eerily quiet, the buildings deserted and dark. It was as if Riley had known exactly where to bring her, away from the bustling city, far from any helpful hands. Finally, after what felt like hours, she spotted a dimly lit gas station at the end of the street. Layla approached it cautiously, scanning her surroundings. She slipped into the small station store, catching the cashier's curious glance as she picked up the payphone. The line rang and she gripped the receiver tightly, her heart pounding in anticipation. She needed someone who would understand, someone who would believe her and act fast. When her colleague Agent Ryan picked up, Layla felt a wave of relief, though she knew there was no time for pleasantries. "Ryan, it's me," she said, her voice urgent and low. "I need help. I've been detained by a corrupt cop, Officer Riley, and I barely made it out. I think he's covering up something huge." A heavy pause hung on the line before Ryan's serious tone cut through. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "Temporarily," she replied, glancing out the window for any signs of pursuit. "I'm at a gas station, outskirts of Atlanta, but Riley's looking for me, and I don't know how long I can keep evading him." "Stay put," Ryan instructed. "I'll pull in a few favors and send back up, but it'll take time. Just keep your head down, Layla." She ended the call, exhaling slowly as the tension in her chest eased slightly. Help was on its way, but she couldn't ignore the cold truth. If Riley found her first, backup wouldn't mean anything. As she stepped out of the gas station, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. Her face was tired, streaked with dust, but her eyes burned with determination. She was no stranger to adversity, and she wasn't about to let Riley get the best of her. Still, the isolation of the street gnawed at her nerves. She needed to find somewhere to hide. But just as she began to move, a car pulled up nearby. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the vehicle. It was the same battered sedan that had been parked outside the precinct earlier. Inside was Officer Lucas, his face pale and tense. He motioned for her to get in, his gaze darting nervously to the street. Layla hesitated. Trusting Lucas was risky, but he had helped her escape, and she didn't have the luxury of options. She slipped into the passenger seat, glancing sideways as he started the car and drove off in silence. After several tense minutes, she finally broke the silence. "Why are you helping me, Lucas?" Her voice was wary, but genuine. She needed to know his motives. Lucas sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied, though his voice betrayed an underlying fear. "Riley? He's been like this for years, Layla. He has everyone at that precinct scared stiff. The higher-ups, the officers, they're all too afraid to cross him. But he's gone too far this time, and I can't keep standing by and watching him ruin lives." She studied his face, watching the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. "You're risking your career by helping me, you know that." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Some things are more important than a career. I couldn't let him get away with this." Layla felt a flicker of admiration for the young officer. She had seen many people in law enforcement buckle under pressure, but here he was, risking it all to help her escape. It made her feel hopeful, but she knew the danger wasn't over yet. "Do you know why he's doing this?" she asked, her tone pressing. "Why he's so desperate to take me down?" Lucas's face grew grim. "Riley's been involved in some shady dealings. A few years ago, he started getting friendly with some very powerful people he shouldn't be involved with. I don't know all the details, but I've heard rumors. Blackmail, payoffs, maybe even tampering with evidence. And anyone who gets too close to finding out ends up like you, caught in some incident that shuts them up for good." Layla clenched her fists, her mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they painted was darker than she'd anticipated. Riley wasn't just an arrogant officer. He was part of a larger scheme, one that could go deep into the precinct and beyond. But before she could process this revelation, Lucas's face paled as he glanced in the rearview mirror. "He's found us," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Layla twisted in her seat, her heart pounding as she saw headlights in the distance, growing closer with every second. "Step on it," she urged, her voice sharp with urgency. Lucas floored the accelerator, the car roaring to life as they sped down the narrow road. The patrol car behind them matched their speed, Riley's siren blaring as he closed in. Layla's mind raced, searching for a plan, a way to outmaneuver him. She could feel the tension radiating off Lucas as he swerved around a sharp corner, trying to shake their pursuer. "Do you know these roads?" she asked, her tone urgent. They were driving deeper into the rural outskirts, the roads winding and narrow, lined with thick trees that blocked out the moonlight. Lucas nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Yeah, there's a spot up ahead where we can turn off. It's risky, but if we can lose him, we might have a chance." Layla braced herself as they veered onto an even narrower path, barely wide enough for one car. The trees loomed closer, their branches scraping against the car windows as they sped through the darkness. But Riley was relentless. His headlights glared in the rearview mirror, unyielding as he pursued them. "Hold on," Lucas warned, his voice tense as he swerved onto a hidden dirt trail. The car bounced and jolted over the uneven ground, and Layla gripped the seat, her heart pounding as they plunged deeper into the forest. For a moment, it seemed they might have lost him. The patrol car was nowhere in sight, and the night was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. But just as they began to slow down, the blinding headlights reappeared, illuminating the trees around them. "Damn it, he's still on us," Lucas muttered, his voice laced with panic. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Layla's mind raced. They couldn't outrun him forever, and with every passing second, their options grew slimmer. But as they rounded a bend, she spotted a narrow footpath veering off the main trail, barely visible in the shadows. "Stop the car," she said suddenly, her voice calm but decisive. "We'll ditch it and head into the woods. He won't be able to follow us on foot." Lucas hesitated, glancing at her with wide eyes. "Are you serious? We'll be sitting ducks out there." "It's our only option," she insisted. "We can't let him catch us. Trust me." Reluctantly, Lucas nodded, pulling the car to a halt and cutting the engine. The silence was deafening as they slipped out of the vehicle, their breaths shallow as they crept toward the footpath. Layla cast a quick glance back, watching as Riley's headlights grew closer, illuminating the trees with an eerie glow. They ducked into the shadows, moving swiftly but carefully along the narrow path. The forest was dense, the branches tangled and dark, obscuring their movements as they pressed deeper into the underbrush. Layla's heart pounded in her chest, every sense on high alert as they wove through the trees, listening for the sound of footsteps or the snap of a branch. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours, the tension thick as they hid among the trees. The distant rumble of an engine signaled that Riley was close, but as they moved further from the road, the sound gradually faded into silence. Layla and Lucas continued deeper into the dense woods, their breaths shallow, each step echoing against the silence. Shadows twisted and stretched around them, concealing their movements, but also amplifying every rustle, every snap of a twig beneath their feet. Layla's senses were on high alert, her mind replaying the last moments with Riley's car in relentless pursuit. The memory still churned in her gut, a bitter reminder that they were far from safe. They crept forward cautiously until the faint sound of snapping branches stopped them in their tracks. Layla held her breath, signaling Lucas to stay silent. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she strained to listen, to pinpoint the sound's direction. Slowly, the noise grew louder, steady, footsteps, deliberate and approaching. Lucas shot her a nervous glance, and she could see the fear in his eyes, the tension rippling through him. He was still young, and she knew he had never faced danger quite like this. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay close, stay quiet, and if anything happens, run." Lucas nodded, though his face was pale, his breath shaky. Layla gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before pressing forward, navigating around a dense thicket. She moved carefully, avoiding dry leaves and brittle branches that could betray their location. But just as they neared a clearing, a figure emerged through the trees, his silhouette stark against the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy. It was Riley. He stood just a few yards away, scanning the area, his flashlight slicing through the shadows as his voice echoed, mocking and cold. "Agent Carter, you think you can run, but there's nowhere to hide. You thought you were untouchable, didn't you?" He laughed, the sound eerie and hollow, cutting through the night air. Layla swallowed the surge of anger and fear that rose in her chest. She couldn't let him see her weakness. She turned to Lucas, gesturing for him to stay hidden behind the trees. She took a deep breath, steeling herself as she prepared to confront Riley. This was a battle she could not avoid. With a calculated step, she emerged from the shadows, her voice calm and steady. "Riley, this is your last chance. You can walk away now, and maybe, just maybe, things won't end as badly for you." Riley's flashlight beam stopped abruptly, illuminating her face. His mouth twisted into a smirk as he sauntered closer, his gaze full of disdain. "Walk away? You're in no position to negotiate, Agent Carter." His voice dripped with arrogance as he took another step forward, the smirk on his face widening. "You've crossed a line. You could have just stayed out of my way, but you didn't know when to stop, did you?" Layla squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze without a trace of fear. "No, I didn't," she replied, her tone steely, "because people like you. Corrupt, power-hungry, you think you can do anything, hurt anyone, as long as it suits you. But that ends here." She hoped her words would chip away at his arrogance, plant a seed of doubt. For a moment, Riley's smirk faltered. A flicker of something else flashed in his eyes. Hesitation? Fear? But he quickly masked it, taking another step forward. "You really believe that, don't you? Like you can waltz in here and save everyone. You're as naive as they come, Carter. The law bends to those who know how to use it." Just then, Layla heard the faintest shuffle of movement behind Riley. Lucas. She tried to suppress the hopeful glint in her eyes as she refocused on Riley, keeping his attention solely on her. "People like you don't last long," she continued, her voice laced with calm confidence. "Because eventually, your greed, your recklessness, it catches up with you." Riley's smile turned cruel, his eyes darkening as he stepped forward, his tone low and mocking. "We'll see who gets the last laugh, Carter. I've got the precinct, I've got power, and what do you have?" He reached for something at his side, and Layla's heart skipped a beat, but she held her ground, refusing to show any fear. But just as he raised his hand, Lucas sprang forward, throwing himself at Riley with a sudden burst of courage. They stumbled, crashing into the ground as the flashlight rolled away, casting eerie shadows around them. Riley let out a growl, struggling against Lucas's hold. Layla took the opportunity, lunging forward to assist, her hands gripping Riley's wrists as she helped Lucas pin him down. "Let go," Riley roared, his voice laced with fury as he thrashed against their grip. But Layla held firm, leaning in close, her voice steady yet fierce. "This is over, Riley. You lost," she whispered, meeting his gaze with unflinching resolve. But just then, he let out a dark chuckle, his lips twisting into a sneer. "You think you've won? You don't know half of what you're dealing with, Carter." His voice was low, menacing, sending a chill down her spine. Layla hesitated, thrown off by his words, but Riley used that split-second opening to break free, shoving her and Lucas back with a sudden burst of strength. He scrambled to his feet, staggering backward before flashing them both a look filled with hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed before disappearing into the shadows, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Lucas cursed under his breath, glancing at Layla, his face etched with worry. "What now? He'll come back for us, you know that." Layla nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "He will, but we won't give him the chance to catch us off guard again." She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "We need to keep moving. He might have bought himself some time, but we're going to be the ones who end this." They continued through the forest, keeping low and moving with a renewed sense of urgency. As they reached a small clearing, Layla spotted an old, abandoned cabin tucked between the trees. It looked derelict, the windows broken, the roof sagging, but it was shelter, a temporary place to regroup. She motioned for Lucas to follow her inside, and they slipped through the creaking door, scanning the room for anything useful. The place was bare, save for a dusty table and a couple of rickety chairs. Layla leaned against the wall, catching her breath as she watched Lucas pace anxiously. "Do you really think we can stop him?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "I mean, this guy's practically untouchable. He's got connections everywhere." Layla met his gaze, a determined glint in her eyes. "Nobody is untouchable, Lucas. Especially not someone like him. Corruption only lasts as long as people stay silent. And I'm done staying silent. Lucas gave her a small, appreciative nod, his face softening with newfound determination. All right, so what's the plan? She thought for a moment, organizing her thoughts. First, we need to document everything. What he said, what he did. Riley won't go down easily, but if we have solid evidence, we'll have a fighting chance. And with backup on the way. She trailed off, a small smile tugging at her lips. He's going to have a very unpleasant surprise. As they began to strategize, a faint glimmer of hope sparked in Layla's chest. They might be outnumbered, but they weren't out of options. And if there was one thing Layla had learned in her career, it was that the truth had a way of catching up, no matter how fast or far someone tried to run from it. But their moment of quiet planning was interrupted by the distant crunch of footsteps outside. Layla tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for her sidearm, only to remember that she'd been disarmed back at the station. She cursed under her breath, glancing at Lucas, who looked just as alarmed. "Hide," she mouthed, motioning for him to move toward the far corner of the cabin. She crouched behind the table, straining to hear as the footsteps drew closer, each step slow and deliberate. Whoever was outside was taking their time, as if savoring the anticipation. The door creaked open, and Layla's heart raced as a figure stepped into the cabin, silhouetted against the dim light. For a split second she thought it was Riley, but then she saw the familiar face of Agent Ryan. Relief flooded through her as he looked around, his eyes landing on her. "Layla," he whispered, motioning for her and Lucas to come forward. "We got here as fast as we could. Are you all right?" Layla nodded, but her relief was short-lived. "Riley's out there. He's not far from here, and he's not going down without a fight." Ryan's face darkened, his gaze hardening. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't get the chance to hurt anyone else. Backup's on standby, but we'll need to tread carefully. He's desperate, which makes him dangerous." Together, they huddled around the table, devising a plan to lure Riley into a trap. Layla's mind whirred with possibilities, piecing together every detail they would need to end this nightmare once and for all. Riley had tried to corner her, to intimidate her, but now she was ready to face him head-on. The real battle was only beginning, and Layla could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. But she was ready. Riley was about to learn that, no matter how far he ran, justice would always catch up with him in the end. As they finalized their plan, Layla's eyes met Ryan's, each of them filled with a mix of determination and unspoken worry. She had been through many challenges in her career, but this felt different. The stakes were personal, and as the seconds ticked by, she could feel the weight of everything Riley had taken from her. Her dignity, her trust in the badge they both wore, and her faith in the system. A faint sound outside snapped her back to the present. Ryan's face grew tense as he held up a hand, motioning for silence. They listened intently as footsteps crunched through the underbrush, circling around the cabin. Layla exchanged a quick look with Lucas, who gripped his flashlight as if it were the only thing tethering him to courage. They barely dared to breathe as they heard Riley's voice, low and taunting, drift through the broken window. "You can't hide from me, Carter. I know you're here. You thought you were smart, thought you could slip away, but I'm always one step ahead." Layla felt her muscles tighten. His voice, dripping with smug arrogance, struck a nerve, but she forced herself to stay calm. Ryan placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring nod. They knew they had to stick to the plan. Riley took another step closer to the door, his shadow looming against the cabin wall, growing and shrinking as he circled the place. Every so often he'd stop, listening intently, as if trying to pinpoint exactly where they were hiding. The suspense in the room was thick, and Layla's heart pounded as the moments stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, with a confident stride, Riley pushed open the cabin door and stepped inside, his eyes glinting with twisted satisfaction. But he hadn't seen Layla yet. He was focused on the emptiness in front of him, his smirk spreading as he took in the abandoned room. "You know, you made this a lot more complicated than it had to be," he sneered, his voice laced with bitterness. Layla was hidden just out of sight, crouched low and holding her breath. She could feel the tension radiating from Lucas, who was tucked in beside her, barely daring to breathe. She motioned for him to stay calm, then signaled to Ryan, who was positioned on the opposite side of the cabin, ready to corner Riley once he was fully inside. Riley stepped further into the cabin, oblivious to the trap tightening around him. Layla could see the twisted satisfaction on his face, as if he had already won, as if he had already stripped away the last shreds of her defiance. But little did he know, the tables were about to turn. With a quick, decisive nod, Layla signaled to Ryan. Together, they rose from the shadows, blocking his escape. "Looking for someone, Riley?" Layla's voice was calm, cutting through the silence with a quiet force. Riley spun around, his face contorting with surprise and then fury as he realized he was cornered. "You're making a mistake, Carter," he growled, trying to keep the upper hand. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she replied, her voice steely. "A corrupt, self-serving officer who abuses his power to intimidate and destroy anyone in his way. But that ends here, Riley." He sneered, his eyes narrowing as he tried to assess his options. "You really think anyone will believe your little story? I have connections that go higher than you can imagine. I'm untouchable." Layla felt a wave of anger, tempered only by her resolve to see this through. "You might have had connections before, but right now, you're on your own." She stepped closer, her eyes locked onto his, unflinching. "And I have enough evidence to make sure you answer for every single one of your crimes." Riley's expression flickered with doubt, a crack in his mask of arrogance, but he quickly covered it up. "Evidence?" he scoffed, but there was a tremor in his voice. "What evidence could you possibly have?" Layla allowed herself a small smile. "People talk, Riley. People you've wronged, people you thought were too scared to speak out. They're not so silent anymore, and they're ready to see justice served." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling like a heavy fog. Layla could see the anger and frustration simmering in Riley's gaze, his facade slipping as the reality of the situation dawned on him. But then his expression darkened, his voice lowering to a dangerous tone. "This isn't over, Carter," he hissed, his eyes flashing with a renewed determination. "I'll make sure you pay for this, you and anyone foolish enough to side with you." Layla met his gaze, unflinching. "You can try, Riley, but you're going to learn that justice doesn't take threats lightly." Just then, the sound of sirens filled the distance, growing louder. A haunting reminder that Riley's time was running out. His face paled, the reality of his situation crashing down on him as he looked between them, realizing there was no escape. The sirens grew closer, flashing lights casting a glow through the cabin windows, illuminating Riley's face twisted with anger and a glimmer of fear. He knew, just as they did, that this was the end. As the backup agents entered the cabin, guns drawn and voices commanding, Riley's bravado finally crumbled. Layla stepped back, watching as they cuffed him, the weight of the moment sinking in as she felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. But as he was led out of the cabin, Riley turned to her one last time, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over, Carter. Remember that." Layla held his gaze, her voice steady and unshaken. "You're right, it's just beginning." As the officers led Riley away, his bitter threats still hanging in the air, Layla let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The adrenaline slowly faded, leaving her both relieved and exhausted. She looked over at Lucas and Ryan, who wore expressions of quiet satisfaction, mixed with disbelief at how close they'd come to danger. Yet, even with Riley in custody, Layla knew this was far from over. His words lingered, echoing in her mind, gnawing at her instincts that something larger was at play. Outside, the cold night air felt fresh against her face as she stepped out of the cabin, looking up at the stars, letting their calm glow settle her nerves. Lucas and Ryan joined her, their faces visibly lighter, though Lucas seemed to carry an extra weight in his gaze. She turned to him, noticing the tension in his stance. "You did well tonight, Lucas," she said, her voice warm with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you." Lucas looked down, his brow furrowed. "Layla, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice uncertain. "Riley, he isn't working alone." He took a shaky breath before continuing. "I didn't think it was true at first, but after everything tonight, I think he's part of something much bigger." Layla's heart sank. She'd suspected as much, but hearing Lucas confirm it brought a sense of urgency. "What do you know?" she pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas hesitated, glancing nervously around as if Riley might reappear at any moment. I overheard some conversations. Riley would talk in hushed tones over the phone with people I'd never seen before, mentioning names, places. He'd say things like, keeping it under wraps or handling loose ends. His voice grew even lower. Layla, I think he's involved in something dangerous, something that goes all the way up. Ryan looked at her, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. You're saying Riley's not the top of this chain? Lucas shook his head. No, there are people more powerful, more hidden. Riley's just a pawn in a larger scheme. Layla clenched her fists, feeling her resolve tighten. This wasn't just about Riley anymore. It was about dismantling a corrupt system that had taken root, one that went against everything she stood for. She looked back at Lucas, determination etched on her face. Then we have to find out who's behind this. We can't stop until we've exposed every single one of them. But just as they turned to leave, a sudden rustling from the bushes nearby froze them in place. Layla's instincts kicked in, and she motioned for the others to stay back. Slowly, she approached the sound, her senses heightened as she prepared for the worst. Out from the shadows stumbled a figure, disheveled and weary-looking. Layla recognized him instantly, Officer Mitchell. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear as he staggered toward them. Mitchell, she exclaimed, rushing to his side. What happened? How did you find us? Mitchell looked up at her, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. I managed to slip away, he gasped, barely able to speak. But they're coming. Riley isn't the only one after you. They know what you're doing, Layla, and they're not going to let you get away with it. The words hit her like a cold shock, and she felt her pulse quicken. Ryan exchanged a tense look with Lucas, who had gone even paler. Layla tightened her grip on Mitchell's shoulder, her voice calm but insistent. Who's coming, Mitchell? Who else is involved? But before he could answer, a loud, mechanical hum filled the air, cutting through the night. Layla turned, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a set of headlights approaching fast from down the road. We have to move, she ordered, motioning for everyone to follow her. We can't let them catch us here. They broke into a sprint, cutting through the trees and away from the cabin, the vehicle's engine growing louder as it neared. Layla's heart pounded as she led them through the dense forest, her instincts guiding her as she navigated through the dark, each step calculated to avoid being seen. Behind her, she could hear the others struggling to keep pace, their breaths coming in quick, anxious gasps. When they finally reached a clearing, Layla stopped, glancing over her shoulder to make sure everyone was still with her. She was about to suggest hiding when Ryan gestured toward a small shed hidden behind some overgrown bushes. There, let's take cover until they pass. They ducked inside, and Layla crouched low, peeking through a crack in the shed door. The headlights drew closer, bathing the forest in an unnatural glow. Her heart pounded as the vehicle slowed, coming to a stop near the spot where they had been just moments ago. Layla held her breath, watching as two men stepped out, their silhouettes menacing against the headlights. The men scanned the area, one of them shining a flashlight through the trees, his voice low but harsh. They couldn't have gone far. Spread out and find them. Riley wants this wrapped up, no loose ends. Layla felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the depth of Riley's operation. These men weren't local officers. They were hired guns, brought in to finish what Riley had started. She looked over at Mitchell, whose face was etched with guilt and fear. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her voice a whisper. You're safe now. Just stay calm, and we'll get out of this. Mitchell nodded, though his eyes darted anxiously to the door. Layla could see the terror in his gaze, and she knew he was on the edge. But this wasn't the time for panic. They needed to think clearly if they were going to survive. After a tense silence, the sound of the men's footsteps faded, and the car door slammed shut. Layla waited, her muscles taut, as the vehicle's engine roared back to life. She watched as the headlights disappeared down the road, the darkness settling once again over the forest. Exhaling in relief, she turned to the others, her voice quiet but firm. We can't stay here. We have to keep moving and find somewhere safe to regroup. Ryan nodded, his face set with determination. There's an old safe house about a mile from here. We can lay low there until we have a clearer plan. They slipped out of the shed, staying low as they navigated the forest, careful to avoid any potential watchers. Layla kept her focus on the path ahead, her mind racing with possibilities. The safe house could buy them time, but she knew it wouldn't be long before Riley's network closed in on them again. Finally, they reached the safe house, a modest, weathered cabin hidden beneath a canopy of trees. Inside, the air was stale, the furniture covered in dust, but it was a sanctuary, a place to gather their thoughts and prepare for the next move. Layla glanced around the room, her mind whirring as she pieced together everything they'd uncovered so far. "We're dealing with more than just one corrupt cop," she said, breaking the silence. "Riley's part of a larger ring, and they're desperate to keep their secrets hidden. We have to be smart, and we have to move fast." Mitchell, who had finally caught his breath, looked at her, his face etched with guilt. "Layla, I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I should have spoken up sooner. I knew something was wrong, but I was too afraid to act." Layla softened, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing by coming to us. Now, we just have to make sure we put an end to this." She paused, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Besides, Riley underestimated us. He never expected we'd be willing to go this far for the truth." Her words brought a glimmer of hope to the room, a reminder that despite the danger, they were on the right path. Ryan and Lucas exchanged determined glances, their resolve hardening. They knew the risks, but they were ready to face whatever lay ahead. As they sat together, mapping out their next steps, Layla felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just a fight for justice. It was a stand against a corrupt system that had betrayed them all. And as they prepared for the challenges to come, she knew one thing for certain. Riley and his network had finally met their match. In the dim light of the safe house, Layla and her team sat huddled around a dusty table, poring over what little intel they had pieced together. Each glance they exchanged conveyed the unspoken gravity of the situation. Layla's mind was racing, her thoughts circling back to every fragment of Riley's words, every detail Lucas and Mitchell had shared. Something larger was at play, and she was beginning to see the twisted web they had stumbled into. Suddenly, the silence in the room was broken by the faint sound of a cell phone vibrating. Layla stiffened, exchanging a wary glance with Ryan. He nodded subtly, urging her to answer. She picked up the device cautiously, her voice tense but calm. "Agent Carter." A voice, cool and calculated, filtered through the line. "Agent Carter, I assume you're well aware that you're digging into matters best left buried. Let's just say, Riley was never your biggest problem." Layla felt a chill run down her spine. She motioned for the others to stay quiet, every instinct telling her to stay calm. "And who might I be speaking to?" she asked, her tone steady despite the tension tightening her chest. The voice on the other end chuckled, a low, ominous sound. "I think you know enough to understand that I don't reveal myself. But know this, Agent Carter, everything you think you know is only the beginning. You're meddling in affairs that have been carefully constructed." Layla's grip tightened on the phone. "You're threatening a federal agent," she said, her voice hardening. "You think that'll make me stop?" Another chuckle, darker this time. "Threats? No, Agent Carter. It's a warning. Stop now, and perhaps you and your associates can walk away unscathed. Continue, and you'll find out just how disposable even someone like you can be." The line went dead, leaving Layla staring at the phone, her mind spinning with the implications of the call. She looked up at her team, their faces a mixture of concern and steely resolve. Lucas spoke first, his voice barely a whisper. "Who was that?" "Someone higher up," Layla replied, her voice strained. "They know we're on to them, and they're trying to scare us off." Ryan crossed his arms, a frown creasing his forehead. "Sounds like we've rattled some cages," he said, his tone dark. "But if they're resorting to threats, that means we're close to something big." Mitchell swallowed, his expression conflicted. "But what if they're right? What if this is bigger than any of us?" Layla placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her voice steady. "That's exactly why we can't back down, Mitchell. People like them thrive on fear, on making others feel small. We're not going to let them intimidate us." Her words sparked a renewed determination in the group, each of them realizing that they were all in this together. They spent the next few hours strategizing, mapping out every potential lead, every thread they could pull. Layla's mind returned again and again to Riley's veiled threats, the cold voice on the phone, and the countless innocent people who had probably suffered at the hands of this corrupt network. Just as they were finalizing their next move, a loud knock echoed through the cabin. The group froze, exchanging tense glances as the knocking grew more insistent. Ryan signaled for everyone to stay silent, motioning for them to hide. Layla ducked behind an old bookcase, her heart pounding as she watched the door. The door creaked open slowly, and in stepped an unfamiliar figure. A tall man with an unassuming expression, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room with a calculated look. Layla recognized the type immediately. He was here on someone's orders, and he wasn't leaving without answers. "Agent Carter," he called out, his voice smooth but carrying an edge of impatience. "You know who I am, and I know you're here. Let's not waste any more time playing games." Layla exchanged a look with Ryan, who gave her a small nod. She took a deep breath, stepping out from her hiding spot, her posture firm and her gaze unyielding. "I'm here," she replied, her voice carrying a calm strength. The man's eyes flashed with a hint of recognition, and he nodded, almost approvingly. "Smart choice, Agent. I'm here on behalf of the people you're trying so hard to expose. I'm offering you one last chance to reconsider your involvement." Layla held her ground, her voice unwavering. "I don't respond well to threats, especially not from people who hide behind others to do their dirty work." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he quickly masked it, his tone smooth. "It's not a threat, it's an invitation to step back before things escalate. You have a promising career, Agent. Don't throw it away over something you don't fully understand." Layla met his gaze, unflinching. "The only thing I understand is that people like you are the reason I joined the FBI in the first place, to hold people accountable, and I'm not stopping until I do." The man's expression hardened, the last trace of his polite demeanor disappearing. "Have it your way," he said, his voice low and threatening. "But remember, Agent Carter, you were given a choice. Don't say we didn't warn you." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar as his footsteps faded into the distance. Layla stood still, her mind racing as she processed what had just happened. The threat was real, and it was coming from powerful people who had no qualms about crushing anyone in their path. Ryan stepped up beside her, his jaw clenched. "They're not just going to let this go, Layla. We need to get everything we have to the Bureau. If this goes any further, it'll be out of our hands." Layla nodded, her gaze steely. "Agreed. But we're not handing this over without a fight. We need to gather more evidence, make it undeniable. If we're going to take them down, we need to make sure they can't talk their way out of it." They spent the next few hours combing through the data they had, analyzing every piece of evidence, every lead. Layla's mind was sharp, her focus unwavering, but beneath her determination lay a simmering anger. A fierce resolve to expose every layer of corruption that Riley and his network had built. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the cabin windows, Layla looked up, exhaustion etched into her face, but a flicker of triumph in her eyes. "We're close," she murmured, her voice a mix of weariness and resolve. "We just need one more piece, something they can't deny." Just then, Mitchell, who had been sifting through some files, froze, his eyes widening. "Layla, I think I found it," he whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and excitement. Layla crossed the room, her heart pounding as she looked over his shoulder at the document he held. A signed agreement tying Riley and his associates to a shell company that had been used to launder money through multiple high-profile cases. It was the smoking gun they had been searching for. Her breath caught, the weight of the discovery sinking in. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is what we needed." But even as they celebrated their breakthrough, the reality of their situation loomed over them. With the evidence in their hands, they had everything they needed to bring down the entire operation, but they also knew it put targets on their backs, and that Riley's network would stop at nothing to silence them. Layla took a deep breath, steeling herself. "We're going to take this to the FBI, expose them for what they are, but we need to move fast. They'll be coming for us." Ryan nodded, his face resolute. "Then let's make sure we're ready." They gathered their belongings, preparing to leave. each of them acutely aware of the danger awaiting them. But as they stepped out into the early morning light, Layla felt a surge of hope. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let fear hold them back now. Together, they moved with purpose, their footsteps steady as they headed toward the truth they had fought so hard to uncover. Layla knew the road ahead would be fraught with obstacles, but with her team by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. This fight was no longer just about Riley or the corrupt individuals behind him. It was about justice, about tearing down a system that had hidden in the shadows for too long. And no matter the cost, she was prepared to see it through to the very end. As Layla and her team left the safe house, their minds were buzzing with a newfound urgency. They had the evidence they needed. Concrete proof that could dismantle Riley's entire operation, but they also understood the high-stakes nature of their mission now more than ever. Riley and his network weren't going to let this evidence go public without a fight. The early morning light filtered through the trees as they walked, their footsteps muted on the forest path. Layla's thoughts were racing, her instincts sharpening with each step. But before they could reach their car, a sudden rustle from the bushes nearby made them all freeze. Layla shot a warning glance at the others, signaling for silence. The sound grew louder, and then, from the thicket, another figure emerged, a man she recognized instantly. It was Eric Dawson, a former agent who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances years ago. Rumors had circulated that he'd been involved in shady dealings, but no one had been able to prove it. Yet here he was, looking rough around the edges, but very much alive. "Layla," he greeted, his voice low and calm, though his eyes were full of something darker, something conflicted. "I'm here to help." Ryan tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his side. "And why would we trust you, Dawson?" he demanded, his voice filled with suspicion. Dawson met his gaze with a resigned sigh. "Because I know what you're up against, and I know exactly how far these people will go. Riley isn't the top of this chain, he's just one player in a much larger game." His expression softened as he turned to Layla. "You're in deep, and if you think you're safe, you're not." Layla narrowed her eyes, studying him closely. Dawson had been notorious for his silver tongue, for bending the truth to suit his own ends. But something in his tone, in the weariness etched on his face, struck a chord with her. She didn't have time to question her instincts. "What do you know?" Dawson took a breath, his gaze shifting between the group before he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They're working with high-level officials, people with power, with influence, people you'd never suspect. Riley was never more than a pawn. But you're going after them with fire, and that's going to get you killed if you're not careful." Layla exchanged a look with Ryan, then with Lucas, who nodded subtly, his expression hardening. They knew Dawson's reputation, but they also knew they needed every bit of information they could get. "Then help us," she replied, her voice unwavering. "If you know how they operate, you can show us where they're vulnerable." Dawson's gaze grew thoughtful, as though weighing her words. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but we'll need to act fast. If they even suspect we're onto them, they'll come down on us with everything they've got." As they made their way through the forest, Dawson revealed a network of hidden accounts, forged documents, and high-level contacts warts Riley's network had relied on to stay undetected for years. The more he spoke, the more intricate the web of corruption became. Layla could feel the enormity of their task pressing down on her, but she also felt a renewed sense of purpose. But just as they were nearing their car, Dawson stopped, his eyes darting around as if sensing something amiss. "Wait," he whispered, his voice tense. "We're being watched." Layla's instincts flared as she scanned the surrounding woods. "How do you know?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Because I was trained to recognize it," he replied, his tone grim. "And if I'm right, they've already locked onto us." A faint click echoed through the trees, followed by the crunch of footsteps. Layla's pulse quickened as she motioned for everyone to take cover. She and Ryan pressed themselves against the trunk of a tree, watching as three men dressed in dark tactical gear emerged, scanning the area with rifles at the ready. Layla's heart pounded as she met Ryan's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. They had no choice, they'd have to fight their way out. She signaled to Lucas and Mitchell, who were crouched nearby, their faces tense but determined. On her count, they sprang into action. Layla darted forward, tackling one of the men and knocking his rifle to the ground. Ryan moved with quick precision, taking down the second man with a series of swift, calculated blows. Lucas and Mitchell backed them up, each using the trees for cover as they engaged the final assailant. The fight was intense, brutal, but quick. Within minutes they had disarmed the attackers, leaving them unconscious on the forest floor. Layla's breath came fast as she glanced around, ensuring the area was clear. Dawson emerged from his cover, nodding approvingly. "Looks like you can handle yourselves," he remarked, though his tone was strained. "But this was just the beginning. They know we're close, and they're going to escalate from here." Layla wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, her gaze hardening. "Then we'll be ready. We're not stopping now." They reached the car, piling in as Layla took the driver's seat, her focus sharp as she maneuvered onto the winding road. Dawson sat beside her, pointing out a back route that would lead them to a secure location. But even as they sped away, she could feel the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on her. After a tense drive, they arrived at a small, secluded motel hidden off the main road. Layla checked in, ensuring that no one saw their faces before they gathered in one of the rooms. It was a tight space, dimly lit with worn furniture that looked like it had seen better days, but it was safe, for now. As they settled in, Dawson pulled out a small laptop accessing a private server that contained encrypted files. "This," he said, his tone serious, "is everything I know. Names, locations, and evidence connecting Riley's network to a chain of powerful officials." Layla leaned in, her eyes scanning the screen as Dawson scrolled through the files. There it was. A list of names, each more surprising than the last. Judges, politicians, law enforcement leaders. Figures she had trusted. People she had thought were allies. A wave of betrayal swept over her, but she quickly pushed it down, focusing instead on the task at hand. "We need to get this to the Bureau," she said, her voice firm. "If we can expose them, the whole operation collapses." Dawson hesitated, his gaze shifting. "There's one more thing. I didn't want to mention it earlier, but there's a meeting, tomorrow night, at a private estate outside the city. They'll be discussing the next phase of their plan. If we can get in, we might just have a chance to bring them all down in one sweep." Layla's eyes widened as the implications sank in. It was a massive risk, but it was also the opportunity they had been waiting for. She turned to her team, each of them wearing expressions of grim determination. "We'll do it," she said, her voice resolute. "But we'll need to be careful. They'll have security, and they'll be on high alert. This isn't just a mission. It's a last stand." Ryan nodded, his face hardening. "Then let's make sure we're ready." They spent the rest of the night preparing, each of them going over the plan, memorizing every detail. Layla could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface, but there was also a shared sense of purpose, a determination that ran deeper than any fear. The next evening, they arrived at the estate, slipping past the perimeter under the cover of darkness. Layla's heart raced as they moved through the shadows, their movements quiet and precise. Dawson led the way, guiding them to a side entrance that led into the main building. Inside, the atmosphere was charged, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the operation. They passed through opulent rooms filled with polished marble and gilded decorations, the opulence a stark contrast to the corruption hidden beneath. Finally, they reached the meeting room, where a group of men and women sat around a long table, their faces shrouded in shadow. Layla recognized some of them immediately. Powerful figures she had seen in the news, in government buildings, people she had once respected. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized just how deeply rooted this network was. But there was no turning back now. She signaled to her team, each of them positioning themselves for the final confrontation. Taking a deep breath, Layla stepped into the room, her voice ringing out with a calm authority that cut through the silence. "The game's over. You're all under investigation for conspiracy, corruption, and abuse of power." The shock on their faces was instant, but as they realized who was standing before them, their expressions hardened, a few of them exchanging knowing glances. One of the officials, a tall man with a steely gaze, spoke up, his voice laced with disdain. You really think you can take us down, Agent Carter? You're outnumbered and outclassed. This isn't some petty case you can close overnight. But Layla held her ground, her gaze steady. Justice might be slow, but it's relentless. And today, it's coming for all of you. The room erupted into chaos, a few members attempting to flee while others tried to intimidate her into backing down. But as her team stepped forward, closing in, Layla knew that no matter what happened next, they had finally shone a light on the corruption that had festered in the shadows for too long. As the officials reacted, some scrambling for the exits, and others sizing up the team with steely defiance, Layla felt the pressure heightening. Each of these powerful people was someone who had maintained their grip on power through deceit and intimidation, and they weren't about to give in without a fight. But Layla's steady, unflinching gaze was fixed on the man across the table, the steely-eyed official who had tried to undermine her with his words. She could see the ripple of anger in his expression as he realized that, for the first time, he was facing someone who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or scared off. "I suggest you sit down," she commanded, her voice carrying a calm authority that filled the room. But instead of complying, he smirked, his lips curling with a mix of amusement and disdain. "And if I don't?" he challenged, his tone mocking. "You're one agent against an entire institution, Carter. Did you really think you could come in here and change anything?" But Layla had been through enough to recognize desperation masquerading as confidence. She held her ground, her voice calm but resolute. "You've underestimated me before, and look where that's brought you." From the corner of her eye, she saw Ryan and Lucas taking positions around the room, ready to intercept anyone attempting to escape. Mitchell held his stance near the entrance, a steady presence despite the tension in his eyes. Each of them knew what was at stake, and they were committed to seeing it through. The tall official's gaze darted around, realizing he was cornered. He cleared his throat, a flash of frustration crossing his face. "You have no idea how far this reaches," he sneered, looking Layla square in the eye. "People like us, we're untouchable. You think this is just some local corruption? It's bigger than you, bigger than the Bureau, bigger than anything you can imagine." His words rang through the room, but Layla only felt her resolve harden. She took a step closer, her voice low but cutting through the tension like a blade. "Maybe you're right, maybe it is bigger than me, but this stops here. People are watching, and the world is a lot smaller than you think. Your days of hiding in the shadows are over." The official's face darkened, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and desperation. But as he took a step forward, another figure entered the room, a familiar face that sent a wave of shock through Layla and her team. It was Riley. His usual smug expression was gone, replaced by a cold, focused look that unsettled Layla. His gaze swept over the room, taking in the scene before landing on Layla. A tense silence settled over the room, the air thick with anticipation. "Agent Carter," he began, his voice calm but laced with menace. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Layla forced herself to stay calm, though she could feel the unease rippling through her team. "It's over, Riley. We have everything we need, and there's nowhere left for you to hide." Riley chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous edge. "You think a few documents and a handful of names are enough? You're playing with fire, Carter. And in this game, people who don't know their limits end up burned." The tall official beside Riley nodded, his gaze shifting between Layla and her team. "You can still back out. Walk away, and we might just let this slide. But keep pushing, and you'll be outmatched, outnumbered, and out of time." Layla held her ground, her voice unwavering. "Threats don't scare me, not from men who hide behind money and power. I've seen your type before. You use people, tear down lives, and think you're invincible. But you're nothing more than cowards, hiding behind lies and corruption." Riley's expression darkened, his composure slipping as he clenched his fists. "You're going to regret this, Carter." But just then, Dawson stepped forward, his face a mask of calm defiance as he looked Riley dead in the eye. "Maybe it's you who should be rethinking things, Riley. You've always been good at talking big, but I'd like to see how well you fare without a horde of goons backing you up." Riley shot Dawson a scathing glare, but Layla caught the flash of hesitation in his eyes. She seized on it, pressing her advantage. "The walls are closing in, Riley. every move you make just tightens the trap. Riley's lips curled into a snarl as he took a step back, weighing his options. He glanced at the other officials, his expression growing increasingly desperate. But then he straightened, his face settling into a cold resolve. "All right, Carter," he said, his voice quiet but dripping with malice. "If you're so determined to dig your own grave, I'll make sure you don't get out." With that, he motioned to the others, who immediately began to reach into their pockets, a flash of metallic objects catching Layla's eye. Her heart raced as she realized what was happening. But before she could react, Riley's voice rang out, cold and final. "Take them down." Chaos erupted. Layla dove behind a nearby pillar, signaling for her team to take cover as a hail of gunfire echoed through the room. She could hear Ryan's voice, calm but tense, as he directed Lucas and Mitchell, each of them moving with practiced precision. The officials fought with an almost feral desperation, Riley at their center, his expression twisted with a mix of fear and fury. Layla ducked, returning fire as she aimed for one of the guards, her mind racing as she calculated their next move. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise. And, more importantly, they had nothing left to lose. As the gunfire continued, Layla caught a glimpse of Dawson, who had taken cover behind a desk, his face set in determination. She locked eyes with him, a silent understanding passing between them. They had to end this, here and now. Moving swiftly, Layla signaled to Ryan and the others, her voice carrying over the chaos. "We push forward on my mark. They're running scared. Don't let them regroup." One by one, her team nodded, their expressions hardening as they prepared for the final assault. Layla braced herself, her heart pounding as she counted down. 3, 2, 1, go. With a surge of adrenaline, they charged forward, navigating through the smoke and debris as they fought their way toward Riley and the others. Layla moved with precision, her movements fluid and controlled as she took down each target with unyielding focus. Finally, they cornered Riley, his back against the wall, his once smug expression replaced by sheer terror. Layla leveled her weapon at him, her voice calm but steely. "It's over, Riley. No more games, no more hiding." Riley's hands shook as he raised them in surrender, his face pale as he looked between Layla and her team. But his eyes held a glint of something else, defiance, even now. "You think this ends with me?" He sneered, his voice trembling. "There will always be more, people with more power, more money. You're just one agent, you can't take down an entire empire." Layla held his gaze, her voice unwavering. "Maybe I can't take down an empire, but I can start with you." Just then, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder as they approached the estate. Layla's heart lifted, relief washing over her as she realized help was finally on the way. Riley's face fell, his bravado crumbling as he glanced toward the door, his last hope slipping away. "You're finished, Riley," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "It's time to answer for everything you've done." As the sirens grew closer, Layla felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing they had finally brought the truth to light. But even as Riley was led away in handcuffs, she knew this was just the beginning. The corruption they had uncovered ran deep, and it would take more than one victory to bring the entire network down. Yet as she looked around at her team, each of them worn but triumphant, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced impossible odds, but they had stood firm, driven by a commitment to justice that could not be shaken. Together, they had taken the first step toward dismantling an empire built on lies and fear. And as they walked out of the estate, the dawn breaking over the horizon, Layla knew that this was the fight she had been meant to lead. This wasn't just about one corrupt cop or one shattered network. It was about restoring faith, standing against the darkness, and ensuring that justice, no matter how difficult, would always prevail. As dawn's first light cast a golden glow over the estate, Layla stood outside, watching as Riley and the captured officials were led away in handcuffs, their expressions a mix of rage and bitter defeat. For a fleeting moment, the weight of their victory settled around her, a hard-won battle against the darkness they had fought so fiercely to expose. But just as she allowed herself a sigh of relief, a figure approached her, their presence sending a familiar, unsettling chill down her spine. It was the same official from the meeting, the one with steely eyes who had first challenged her resolve. Even now, with his hands bound, He managed a sinister smile. "You think this changes anything, Agent Carter?" he murmured, his tone dripping with quiet menace. "Do you have any idea how many people were watching tonight? People with more power, more resources than you could ever imagine. They'll find you, and when they do, you'll wish you had walked away." Layla met his gaze with unwavering resolve, refusing to let his words shake her. "We'll be ready," she replied, her voice steady. "This time, people like you won't get to hide." The official only smirked, his eyes gleaming with a confidence that unsettled her, even as he was forced into a patrol car. And as it sped away, Layla couldn't shake the feeling that she was still just scratching the surface, that Riley's network, with all its hidden shadows, was far from vanquished. Turning to her team, she saw the same determination mirrored in their eyes, yet each of them seemed to sense the storm brewing ahead. Ryan, standing beside her, spoke up, his voice low and cautious. "We hit them hard today, Layla, but something tells me they're not done with us yet." Layla nodded, her mind already calculating their next steps. "We've made powerful enemies, that's for sure, but they've underestimated us, and that'll be their mistake." As they left the estate, heading toward a new dawn and a new phase of their mission, Layla couldn't ignore the quiet voice echoing in her mind. They had struck a blow tonight, but this was only the beginning. The deeper layers of corruption they'd glimpsed were still out there, lurking, waiting to strike back. And as they walked into the sunrise, Layla's voice held a quiet determination as she turned to her team. "All of this," she said, glancing around at each of them, "was only the beginning. If you're as ready as we are to see where this fight for justice leads next, be sure to let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, share this video with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We're just getting started, and there's so much more to uncover. Stay tuned for the next video."